Well, welcome back to another week's analysis behind the news. Very interesting article appeared in the Wall Street Journal last Friday. And the title of it is Europe's Crowning Glory, Imperils Postwar Project. And they start off saying the very things that we've been saying about the European Union for decades. Now that it's a done deal, they can come out in the open and say exactly what it is. But it's very interesting that people denied for a long, long time what we were saying about what they were putting together in Europe. And they still deny the things that we say about where it's going from here. But let me read you the first few paragraphs. And this is, of course, the problem with this is it's going to be talking about Greece, and then we'll talk about that in a moment. Said the great project that some hoped would eventually create a European superstate faces the biggest challenge of its 65-year history on Sunday. Now, let's reread that because this is very important. There's a little nuance in here that escapes most readers. The great project that some hoped would eventually create a European superstate faces the greatest challenge of its 65-year history on Sunday. Now, everybody thinks that they put the EU together just recently. We've been telling them that this is a project that started very quickly after World War II, and it was actually Hitler's program originally. All they did was reconstruct it under international socialism instead of national socialism. 65-year history. The EU hasn't existed for 65 years, has it? But they understand that it really has. See, the perception is it hasn't. The reality is it really did. They put the first step, the second step, the third step, all very innocuous until finally they revealed their hand as to what was really going on. Just like we're trying to say is going on with the so-called free trade and NAFTA and that sort of thing. To continue. When Greeks vote on a referendum that could decide whether they crash out of the Eurozone and shift the continent's destiny. The European Union, whose precursor brought the region's warring nations together after World War II, they were already together. You see, they were all under Hitler mostly, but then they came together under this new system of international socialism instead of national socialism, a pox on both their houses, and later helped cement a Western trajectory for many countries in the former Soviet bloc. Isn't set to break up, but it has stumbled badly on the path toward what supporters saw as its future, an ever closer communion of nations. What has largely brought this about is the instrument that was seen as its crowning glory. Now we finally find out what that is, the euro. That's the common currency of the EU. In order to do these things, you have to have a common currency. Once you have a common currency, it's a huge step towards the unification of all of these countries because they use the same currency, go to the same central bank, etc., etc. But isn't it interesting, ladies and gentlemen, that the primary country in Europe that seems to be the decision maker for the European Union is Germany. And also the head of Germany is a former communist leader, ex-communist, like a lot of them in Europe are. Well, at any rate, in the face of all this, the Greeks, as we all know now, defied Europe and at 61% voted against the austerity program. You know, socialists don't like austerity. And people who receive benefits from socialist governments don't like austerity either. And so naturally they would vote against it. But the idea that the European Union is going to break up over all of this, even if Greece leaves, which I doubt will happen, but let's say that it does. Will Italy and Portugal and Spain follow? Possibly, if the same economic situation is there. But it's only a setback. These are just steps back. They always take 2 steps forward and 1 step back. That way it looks like a compromise, but it's still a step forward, isn't it? And whether these things cause the European Union to falter, have a momentary glitch, doesn't matter. Because as we have explained more often than not, that the European plan is for it to be united under the leadership of Moscow. You've already got a lot of European Union countries led by so-called ex-communists who took their orders directly from Moscow. And they still do. And that's what's going to happen. Gorbachev told us that the EU is the new Soviet of Europe, and that it would eventually go from the Atlantic to the Urals. Actually, that's a half-truth. It will go all the way to Vladivostok. But at any rate, the thing is that we have been bailing Europe out anyway. They say that the central bank and the Reichsbank and that sort of thing have been bailing out Greece. But really, ladies and gentlemen, the Fed's been bailing out Europe. And we've explained that before, doing it through what they call currency exchanges. We exchange dollars for euros, and we put the euros in the basement and don't spend them, and they spend the dollars. And that's how they're being bailed out. It's very common in our history to help our enemies and our allies and everybody else. Those of us who've been involved in this for years know that we sustained Russia for a long time when it was called the USSR. We built China into what it is today, have we not? That's our doing. Our economy, our workers, our people, our savings, our investments have literally created or sustained Russia and created the monster we see today in China. And we still do it with terrorism and everything else. But we've discussed that before. One of the things that I want to make sure is that when you start to read things about quantitative easing and the IMF and the World Bank and the European Commission and the European Central Bank and all of that, it will ultimately move towards that goal of one Europe and one bank. And that will be ruled out of Moscow, even though the lines may not be there. We've said this before. The lines into terrorism come out of Moscow primarily, and yet you don't see those lines. Instead, they get you to look at Muslims. They get you to look over here. They get you to look over there. But in reality, the training and everything else, with some exceptions, we're actually doing some of the terrorists, comes from the Moscow leadership. One thing I want to end on, because a lot of this is just rehashing things we've said before relative to Europe, and that is this past week could be very disheartening for a lot of patriots. Don't be disheartened. You know, I've been in this business for well over 50 years, and at any point I could have become disheartened over what was going on. You can't allow that to happen. What you've got to do is dig deep in yourself and say to yourself, I'm going to work harder. I'm going to do more. I'm going to do something if you're not doing anything other than simply complaining about it. If you're in chat rooms, if you're attending family picnics or whatever, and you all talk about politics, it doesn't mean anything. The John Birch Society is not a meet, eat, and retreat organization. We meet to decide what to do and then go out and do something about it. And that's what you have to do. You're not disheartened if you're actually engaged in the fight itself at the proper level, in the proper way. Don't be disheartened. Just simply say, I'm going to do more. And I'm going to get other people to join me in this fight as well. And so I want to leave you with that message. I'm not giddy. I know things look bad. But, you know, they sometimes look very dark just before the dawn. And don't think for a minute that these people on the other side don't make mistakes. They do. And we can capitalize on those mistakes. And so think about that and get to work. Until next week, we'll see you then.